having experienced what it is to have very, very low levels of dopamine, has given me tremendous sensitivity to the fact that dopamine is perhaps one of the most powerful molecules that any of us has inside of us, and the one that we ought to all think very carefully about how we leverage. Because while most experiences and most things that we do and take and eat and etc. won't create enormous highs and enormous lows in dopamine, even subtle fluctuations in dopamine really shape our perception of life and what we're capable of and how we feel. And so we want to guard those and we want to understand them. And let's talk about some tools that we can all use to leverage dopamine in order to keep that baseline in the appropriate healthy place and still be able to access those peaks in dopamine, because those, after all, are some of what makes life rich and worth living. So what sorts of activities, what sorts of things increase dopamine? And how much do they increase dopamine? Well, let's take a look at some typical things that people do out there or ingest out there that are known to increase dopamine. Some are good for us, some are not good for us. And let's ask how much dopamine is increased above baseline. Chocolate. They didn't look at milk versus dark chocolate, but chocolate will increase your baseline level of dopamine 1.5 times. Okay, so it's a pretty substantial increase in dopamine. It's transient. It goes away after a few minutes or even a few seconds. Sex, both the pursuit of sex and the act of sex, increases dopamine 2 times. So it's a doubling above baseline. Now, of course, there's going to be variation there, but that's the average increase in baseline dopamine caused by sex. Nicotine, in particular nicotine that is smoked, like cigarettes and so forth, increases dopamine 2.5 times above baseline. So there's a peak that goes up above baseline 2.5 times higher. It is very short-lived. Anyone who's ever been a chain smoker or observed a chain smoker understands that the increase in dopamine from nicotine is very short-lived. Cocaine will increase the level of dopamine in the bloodstream 2.5 times above baseline. And amphetamine, another drug that increases dopamine, will increase the amount of dopamine in the bloodstream 10 times above baseline. A tremendous increase in dopamine. Exercise. Now, exercise will have a different impact on the levels of dopamine depending on how much somebody subjectively enjoys that exercise. So if you're somebody who loves running, chances are it's going to increase your levels of dopamine 2 times above your baseline, not unlike sex. People who dislike exercise will achieve less dopamine increase or no increase in dopamine from exercise. And if you like other forms of exercise like yoga or weightlifting or swimming or what have you, again, it's going to vary by your subjective experience of whether or not you enjoy that activity. So some people like chocolate, some people don't, of course, but in general, it causes this increase in dopamine. But sex, nicotine, cocaine, amphetamine, those things cause increases in dopamine in everybody that takes them. Things like exercise, studying, hard work, working through a challenge in a relationship, or working through something hard of any kind, that is going to be subjective as to how much dopamine will be released. Caffeine will increase dopamine to some extent, but it is pretty modest compared to the other things that I described: chocolate, sex, nicotine, cocaine, amphetamine, and so on. So let's talk about the optimal way to engage in activities or to consume things that evoke dopamine. And by no means am I encouraging people to take drugs of abuse. I would not do that. I am not doing that. But some of the things on these lists of dopamine evoking activities are things like chocolate, coffee, even if it's indirect, sex and reproduction, provided it's healthy, consensual, context appropriate, age appropriate, species appropriate, of course, is central to our evolution and progression as a species. So certain things like cocaine, amphetamine, I will put in the classification of bad. I'm willing to do that. And other things are part of life. Food, exercise, if that evokes your dopamine. How are we supposed to engage with these dopamine-evoking activities in ways that are healthy and beneficial for us? How do we achieve these peaks, which are so central to our well-being and experience of life, without dropping our baseline? And the key lies in intermittent release of dopamine. The real key is to not expect or chase high levels of dopamine release every time we engage in these activities. Intermittent reward schedules are the central schedule by which casinos keep you gambling, the central schedule by which elusive partners or potential partners keep you texting and pursuing on either side of the relationship. There's something called dopamine reward prediction error. When we expect something to happen, we are highly motivated to pursue it. If it happens, great. We get the reward. The reward comes in various chemical forms, including dopamine. And we are more likely to engage in that behavior again. If you're not a gambler and that doesn't appeal to you, I have to imagine there's something that appeals to you, something that you do repeatedly because you enjoy it. And almost inevitably, it's because there's an intermittent schedule. There's an intermittent schedule by which dopamine sometimes arrives, sometimes a little bit, sometimes a lot, sometimes a medium amount, okay? That intermittent reinforcement schedule is actually the best schedule to export to other activities. How do you do that? Well, first of all, if you are engaged in activities, school, sport, relationship, etc., where you experience a win, you should be very careful about allowing yourself to experience huge peaks in dopamine unless you're willing to suffer the crash that follows and waiting a period of time for it to come back up. What would this look like in the practical sense? Well, let's say you are somebody who really does enjoy exercise. Or let's say you're somebody who kind of likes exercise but forces yourself to do it, but you make it pleasureful by giving yourself your favorite cup of coffee first, or maybe taking a pre-workout drink, or taking an energy drink, or listening to your favorite music, and then you're in the gym and you're listening to your music. That all sounds great, right? Well, it is great, except that by layering together all these things to try and achieve that dopamine release, and by getting a big peak in dopamine, you're actually increasing the number of conditions required to achieve pleasure from that activity again. And so there is a form of this where sometimes you do all the things that you love to get the optimal workout. You listen to your favorite music, you go at your favorite time of day, you have your pre-workout drink if that's your thing. You do all the things that give you that best experience of the workout for you. But there's also a version of this where sometimes you don't do the dopamine enhancing activities. You don't ingest anything to increase your dopamine. You just do the exercise. You don't do the exercise and expect dopamine to arrive through some what we call exogenous source as well. You might think, well, that sounds lame. I want to continue to enjoy exercising. But that's exactly the point. If you want to maintain motivation for school, exercise, relationships, or pursuits of any duration and kind, the key thing is to make sure that the peak in dopamine, if it's very high, doesn't occur too often. And if something does occur very often, that you vary how much dopamine you experience with each engagement in that activity. There are activities that we can do that will give us healthy, sustained increases in dopamine, both the peaks when they happen and to maintain or even increase our baseline levels of dopamine. So how do we do that? What are some of these activities? Well, in recent years, there's been a trend toward more people doing so-called cold exposure. First of all, some of the safety parameters. Let's establish those first. Getting into very, very cold water, 30 degree Fahrenheit or even low 40 degree Fahrenheit, can put somebody into a state of cold water shock. I mean, people can die doing that. So obviously, you want to approach this with some caution. But for most people, getting into 60 degree water or 50 degree water, or if you're acclimated and comfortable with it, 40 degree water or 45 degree water can have tremendously beneficial results on your neuromodulator systems, including dopamine. What temperature of water you can tolerate will depend on how cold water adapted you are and how familiar you are with the experience of getting into cold water. really interesting study that was done and published in the the European Journal of Applied Physiology. What they looked at were the concentrations of things like epinephrine and dopamine and so on. And what they found was really interesting. First of all, upon getting into cold water, the changes in adrenaline and noradrenaline, epinephrine and norepinephrine, were immediate and fast, and these were huge increases. So that's the getting into the cold water that everybody experiences, these huge increases in adrenaline. But then what was interesting is they observed that dopamine levels started to rise somewhat slowly and then continued to rise and reach levels as high as 2.5 times above baseline. That's a remarkably high increase. Remember, if we go back to our examples of chocolate, sex, a doubling above baseline, nicotine, 2.5 times above baseline, cocaine, the increase in dopamine from cold water exposure of this kind was comparable to what one sees from cocaine, except in this case, it wasn't a rise and crash. It was actually a sustained rise in dopamine that took a very long time, up to 3 hours, to come back down to baseline, which is really remarkable. And I think this explains some of the positive mental and physical effects that people report subjectively after doing cold water exposure. One question that many of you are probably asking is, just how cold should the water be? Well, you could mimic what was done in this study and do 14 degrees Celsius, but for some people that won't be cold enough. For some people that will be too cold. That actually could be dangerous for a lot of people. You might have a hard time reheating, and hypothermia is not a good thing. They were able to reheat them afterwards. It's well established now that getting into cold water, whether or not it's a shower, an ice bath, circulating cold water, a stream, etc., that can evoke the norepinephrine release immediately and the long arc of that dopamine release. Why would that be good? Up until now, I've basically said getting increases in dopamine are detrimental to your baseline. Well, this does appear to raise the baseline of dopamine for substantial periods of time, and most people report feeling a heightened level of calm and focus after getting out of cold water. So cold water exposure turns out to be a very potent stimulus for shifting the entire milieu, the entire environment of our brain and body, and allowing many people to feel much, much better for a substantial period of time after getting out of the ice bath or cold water of any kind than they did before. Now, you might ask how often to do this. Some people do this every day. It can be very stimulating, so typically doing it early in the day is going to be better. I don't necessarily recommend doing it right before sleep, but some people do it in the afternoon, and some people will indeed do that 7 days a week. Other people 3 days a week. Other people every once in a while. What I can say is, once you become cold water adapted, once it no longer has the same impact of novelty and feeling a bit like I don't want to say a shock to your system because you don't want to go into cold water shock, but once it is comfortable for you, then it will no longer evoke this release. There really does seem to be something in the pathway from cold water exposure through the norepinephrine pathway and into the mesolimbic brainstem that causes this release in dopamine.